In the top stories, agriculture and food security to be covered on tonight's Leadership Matters program. Cuba has a new leader and it's not a Castro. And jury considers verdict in George Floyd murder trial. Hello and welcome to the ZIZ Midday Newscast. Today is Tuesday, the 20th of April, 2021. I'm Jason Davis. Nationally, on tonight's edition of Leadership Matters, Prime Minister Dr. the Honorable Timothy Harris will be joined by Chief Veterinary Officer Tracy Challenger, Permanent Secretary in the Ministry of Agriculture Ron Collins, Sharon Jones from AICA, and farmer Winston Morris. Tonight's program will focus on agriculture and food security. Leadership Matters, which starts at 8 o'clock, airs on ZIZ Radio and other participating radio stations. It is also streamed live on social media platforms, including the Facebook and YouTube pages of the St. Kitts and Nevis Information Service, and of course will be carried live on ZIZ TV. The St. Kitts Nevis chapter of the Caribbean Association of Medical Technologists, or CASMET, will be joining its regional partners in celebrating Medical Laboratory Professionals Week. During an interview for the Care Nursing Agency Health series on ZIZ TV, local chairperson of CASMET, Jasmine Hanley, gave a brief background of the association, which helped to provide training for technologists within the medical field.
Formed in 1954 in Jamaica, the pathology department in Jamaica, and that became an organization for the medical technologists in the region. At that time there weren't training schools, so CASMET undertook a number of training opportunities to train technologists in the various professions.
She added that CASMET now has training schools in Barbados, Bermuda, Belize, and countries in the Eastern Caribbean. Hanley said in the past, activities to commemorate the week included a church service and health walks.
We have, in the past, we've done small projects like, well, of course, we always have church services to celebrate to start off the week. We have assisted or supported Ross University in opening up for open day to schools and students. We have done a health walk. We have done a gift to one of our geriatric homes in Sadler's, and a number of small projects.
The Medical Laboratory Professionals Week is being celebrated this year from April 18 to 25. In other news, the Rotary Club of Lyamiga kicked off its 2021 book drive recently with a donation of 30 boxes of books and other pieces of reading material to the Charles A. Halbert Public Library in Basse-Terre. The books were received by the enthusiastic staff who were grateful for the donation. The book distribution initiative is an ongoing program of the club and has spanned 5 years. According to a press statement, the club hopes to continue the initiative over the coming months, with donations made to libraries and schools across St. Kitts and Nevis. The Rotaract Club of Nevis will also collaborate for books to be donated to the primary schools on Nevis as well. These donations are made possible through the efforts of the Rotary Club of Lyamiga and the Second Wind Foundation. Moving now to news on the regional scene, Cuban Communist Party leader Raul Castro has officially passed the baton to Miguel Diaz-Canel in the closing session of the 8th Party Congress. This makes Diaz-Canel Cuba's president and the head of the party, the first person to run the island who is not a Castro since the 1959 revolution. The former engineer faces a collapsing economy and growing dissent, especially among younger Cubans. Al Jazeera's Lucia Newman has this report.
Raul Castro passing on his post as first secretary of the all-powerful Communist Party to 60-year-old President Miguel Diaz-Canel, an image that is supposed to signal the end of the Castro era, although not quite.
Comrade Raul, for legitimacy and because Cuba needs him, will be consulted on the most important strategic decisions for the destiny of the nation.
While billboards hailed the Communist Party as the soul of the revolution, its 8th Congress transpired behind closed doors. Cubans waited to hear if a much-promised generational change would finally take place.
We expect positive changes because the younger generation is more modern in accordance with our times and open to changes that we need, especially in the economy.
But when the names of the new Politburo were finally announced on state media, 4 of the 14 members were 77 years old and the rest between 50 and 60. Fidel Castro was 33 and Raúl 29 when they took power more than 6 decades ago. Like Raúl Castro, Díaz-Canel will also hold the position of president of Cuba at a challenging time, when the economy is collapsing and dissent increasing. Opponent Rosa Maria Payá says the Communist Party won't change.
The most part of the Cuban families are struggling in a humanitarian scale crisis, and the answer of the regime have been more repression, more violence. In their case, to have the slightest opening means for them to put their absolute power at risk. And that is something that they don't want to do.
Cuba's Communist Party is one of only 4 in the world that remains in power and describes its future as one of continuity. Guaranteeing that continuity with a more emboldened younger generation of Cubans may no longer be so easy. Lucia Newman, Al Jazeera.
St. Lucians who make a living on cruise vessels could face mandatory vaccinations in order to be eligible to head back out to sea. One of the main recruiting agencies outlined the terms of employment of some of the industry's most popular cruise liners. More in this report.
Out on open waters. But not so fast, says Sales and Marketing Manager Mampa Agency Jackie Ravenou, as new vaccination stipulations are in order before crewmates head out to sea.
Lots of the assignments will be in Europe for this particular moment. Okay, so what we're here to say, to let people know, is that in order for anybody to go back on board, that's people who's been on the ships before and new people who's interested in working on board a ship. What happens now is that they would have to get a vaccine.
Ravenou explains that persons can either receive their vaccination on island or on board the vessel. However, those who have received their vaccines in country must be fully vaccinated before boarding the vessel.
To every crew member who's in country at the moment, that in order for you to go back to work, depending on the cruise line is very important, is most important, because at this moment, at this juncture right now, not all the cruise line are asking you to be vaccinated. This is not right across the board. Everybody needs to understand that. It's not because I want to work on a ship, I need to get vaccinated. It's not right across the board.
Mampa Employment Agency fills vacancies for large cruise liners, including but not limited to Royal Caribbean International, Carnival, Norwegian Cruise Line, and Disney Cruise Line. Media personnel inquired as to which cruise lines were requesting mandatory vaccination of all their crew members.
This is a question, as I said before, that I'm not going to say I'm not going to say right now. This is not for me to say. Okay, this is if the cruise line would like to sort of say which cruise lines are mandating for you to be vaccinated, then they will say. But as a manning agent, my job is to actually say to the individuals who are going on board ships what the criterias are.
The issue of mandatory vaccination has stirred passionate debate, with the Rastafarian community advocating for freedom of choice when it comes to the jab. Now, crewmates who have been out of work since March 2020 will have a choice to make: take the jab or risk losing out on a much-needed employment opportunity in these most difficult of times. Solange Alfred, HTS News Force.
Internationally, the jury has begun deliberating the fate of a former U.S. policeman, Derek Chauvin, accused of killing a black man, George Floyd, after kneeling on his neck for more than 9.5 minutes. The court heard closing arguments from both sides on Monday. Chauvin faces up to 40 years in prison on 3 charges. Al Jazeera's John Hendren reports.
Otherwise, we are in recess until we hear from the jury.
In their final words on the most highly charged U.S. civil rights case in decades, prosecutors told jurors to trust their eyes.
But for the defendant's actions, pushing him down, would George Floyd have died that day? Was it drugs? He just miraculously die of a drug overdose in that time? Maybe it was the tailpipe. Maybe it was his enlarged heart. Maybe not. Use your common sense. Use your common sense. Believe your eyes. What you saw, you saw.
What the jury saw was the same 9.5 minutes the world saw of then Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck until paramedics carried off his lifeless body. In a case that started with an allegedly fake $20 bill and ended with protests and riots across the United States, prosecutors said the evidence proved Chauvin used excessive force, choked the life out of Floyd, and refused to render medical care even after he showed no pulse.
Roll him on the side.
And at the time of causing the death, the defendant committed or was attempting an assault in the 3rd degree. And that's been proved beyond a reasonable doubt. With those being proved in the venue, right, 2nd degree felony murder, the defendant is guilty.
The defense argued that Chauvin held Floyd face down just as he was trained to.
Was putting Mr. Floyd in an eminently dangerous act. We've heard a lot about the prone position. Consider just the basic prone position. People sleep in the prone position, people suntan in the prone position, people get massages in the prone position. The prone position in and of itself is not an inherently dangerous act. A prone position during restraint is not an inherently dangerous act. It is routinely trained and used by the Minneapolis Police Department.
Defense lawyer Eric Nelson blamed bystanders for Chauvin's failure to administer life-saving CPR, saying he felt unsafe. And hoping to give jurors enough reasonable doubt for an acquittal, he offered a broad array of alternative theories for Floyd's death: heart trouble, drugs, even car exhaust.
We have to analyze this case from the perspective of a reasonable police officer at the precise moment with the totality of the circumstances when it comes to the use of force.
Chauvin's fate now lies in the hands of the jury, which is in isolation until they can render a unanimous verdict. One reason for sequestering them is to make sure they don't hear news of protesters demanding Chauvin's conviction. But with demonstrations across the country, it's not clear they won't be able to hear protests from where they're deliberating. Deliberations can range dramatically in length. In 1992, it took 7 days for jurors in the police beating of Rodney King to find 4 officers not guilty. 3 years later, jurors took less than 4 hours to declare O.J. Simpson not guilty of murder. For Chauvin and for residents of Minneapolis and cities across the U.S., that wait will be filled with anxiety and fear for what comes next. John Hendren, Al Jazeera, Minneapolis.
And now for the weather. Current conditions are cloudy skies with a slight haze. Winds are moderate from an easterly direction at 16 miles per hour. The temperature is 29 degrees Celsius or 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Seas are moderate with waves of 5 to 6 feet. The weather forecast for St. Kitts and Nevis today says it'll be mostly sunny and dry. Tonight it should be partly cloudy with a 20% or slight chance of showers. Sunset today will be at 6:28 p.m., sunrise tomorrow at 5:50 a.m. And that brings us to the end of the ZIZ Midday newscast. Join us this evening for these stories and more in detail. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Jason Davis.